The bald light overhead flickers, glinting harshly off the silverware on the table. A small restaurant, hardly busy this early in the evening, buzzes faintly with the sound of unstructured chatter and the scrape of plates against lacquered wooden tables. At the far end, a table sits occupied by a black woman, dressed sharply in a burgundy dress. Her posture is composed, dignity radiating from her every movement. She eats quietly, her eyes occasionally darting toward the window beside her, where the last traces of daylight fade into deep orange. At a neighboring table, another figure leans forward, her voice loud enough to rise over the calm murmur of the setting. She is a middle-aged white woman, garbed in an air of entitlement as much as in her cashmere sweater. Her words aren't directed to the black woman, but somehow they feel aimed at here-appointed, passive performance echoing off the walls. I just don't get how some people, she says, elongating the word in a way you couldn't mistake for anything but disdain, think they belong everywhere now, no matter the neighborhood. Her dining partner, a man with similarly aloof features, grins half-heartedly and shifts uncomfortably in his chair. The words bounce, aimless for a moment, before finding their target, the woman in burgundy. The silent shift in the room, eyes drawn, breaths held, signals that she's heard it. How could she not? Still, she says nothing. She is a pillar of restraint, unmoving save for the deliberate cut of her fork into her food. But restraint isn't armor enough to deflect the next escalation. The white woman rises, muttering under her breath, and moves toward the counter under the thin pretense of asking for a refill for her drink. Yet, as she returns, something in her gait stiffens as she catches sight of the solitary black woman again. Something feral pride, prejudice, perhaps something even smaller but infinitely uglier, flares in her chest. And then, in a single motion, it happens. One sleeve of the burgundy dress catches on the white woman's approaching hand. The tear is as faint as it is symbolic. A seam splits, fabric frays, gasps ripple across the restaurant. All at once, diners stop in mid-bite. The rustling of conversation dies to suffocating silence. The tearing sound lingers between the two women, a fault line in the fabric of civility. The black woman stands reflexively, one hand clutching the ripped fabric. For the first time, her voice appears, cut sharp but measured. "What are you doing?" The other woman scoffs as though this had been inevitable. "It was an accident, don't be so dramatic," she says with a venom that contradicts any claim of mistake. Control twists and rearranges itself in the black woman's quiet insistence. "That wasn't an accident, and you know it. Apologize." The words linger, heavier than the tension in the air. The white woman stares, incredulous, and instead of stepping back, she takes a step forward as if proximity could lend her aggression greater weight. Whatever power dynamics rule her world status, privilege seemed to buckle momentarily as the victim's eyes meet hers. Nearby, another party of two has ceased eating altogether to observe the escalating drama. One man, whose pale complexion carries the flush of embarrassment, mutters something to his companion. Do something before this goes too far, perhaps, though his words barely carry across their table. And then, a new voice emerges, not from the disputing women, but from just across the room. "Ma'am." The black woman's dining companion, a man in his mid-30s, his tailored suit suggesting a certain success, calls out, his tone direct but not loud. He stands visibly calm, though there is an ineffable hardness in his gaze toward the white woman. "You're making a scene, and more importantly, you just crossed a line." But even as he speaks, his words aren't the only ones overheard. At the counter where the staff has huddled nervously, faint whispers pass between them. "Should we call someone? This is escalating." But they hesitate. Action or inaction, it looms delicately on the edge of this charged encounter. Back by the table, the white woman's husband has finally risen, though his posture suggests reluctance more than any sense of obligation. His wife, emboldened by his presence, shoots one last sneer toward the black woman and her companion before turning on her heel to leave. What no one notices immediately, what arrives as a slow, creeping realization to everyone except the black woman, comes in the form of a single act of betrayal. She watches, almost too calmly, as her own husband pulls his chair back, places a few bills on the table, and walks out, not to chase the hostile pair, but to leave entirely. No explanation, no glance back. He doesn't even meet her gaze. Her breath stops momentarily. How could he just leave? Wasn't the moment for solidarity clear? Her shoulders stiffen, the composure she had fought so hard to retain now threatening to crumble. For the first time that evening, she shows not dignity, but raw, unfiltered emotions, shock, anger, and a sense of abandonment swirling in her wide eyes. And yet, her voice refuses to rise, refuses to cry out after him. She sits once more, silent and alone. From the front door, the chime of a bell breaking the subdued atmosphere signals yet another presence entering or exiting. The room collectively looks, waiting to see who or what will change next in this unraveling tableau of strained civility. The fading sunlight vanishes entirely into dusk, yet the restaurant's undeniable tension hangs static, almost choking. The black woman remains seated at her table, frame rigid, her burgundy dress still unbearably conspicuous with its torn seam. She feels the pull of dozens of eyes, some fleeting with discomfort, others openly gawking. But she doesn't glance at them. No, her gaze lingers on the empty spot where her husband had been moments before. The ache of his absence eclipsed even the sting of the fabric. The betrayal is silent but deafening. Just across the room, the group of servers remains huddled. The faint whispers have grown louder and more animated. "One of us should just ask them to leave," a young male employee with nervous eyes mutters. Another server, older and seemingly more accustomed to tense confrontations, responds firmly, "Not yet, let's not escalate it." But her words falter, drowned by the soft, anguished sound of a chair scraping against the wooden floor. The black woman rises slowly, deliberately, her face a mask of composure once again. She clutches her small purse, fingers toying absent-mindedly with its clasp. She surveys the room, eyes brushing past every stare directed at her. Yet she never meets them. With quiet dignity, she turns, stepping toward the door, her heels echoing unapologetically in the stillness. But before she exits, the bell on the door jingling just behind her, another voice cuts through the silence. It's soft at first, but unmistakably firm. Her dining companion, the man in the tailored suit. Wait. It's not loud enough to command the entire restaurant, but it freezes her just the same. Her steps halt, though her back remains to him. She doesn't turn, but it's clear she's anticipating something. Anything. The man approaches, measured in his movements, closing the gap restrainedly. "You shouldn't leave," he tells her, his voice carrying the weight of an offer, though he refrains from touching her arm to stop her. Walking out might feel easier, but it would let them believe they've succeeded. She finally turns, her face unreadable but her slight hesitation speaking volumes. "Succeeded at what?" she counters, her tone more tired than defiant. "Humiliating me in public? Reminding me exactly where I don't belong no matter how I dress or carry myself? Because if that's winning to them, they've won already." Their conversation, soft yet charged, begins to draw subtle attention from those seated nearby. Some lean slightly closer, under the guise of appearing indifferent. Others have given up the pretense entirely, shamelessly invested in this unfolding narrative. The man stays silent, grappling visibly with how to respond. Finally, he says, "What's left of this evening isn't about them, it's about you." Words, stares, and accidental tear, they don't define dignity, but shrinking away from your own space does. Her eyes narrow, studying him as though searching for a trap hidden in the plainness of his logic. "I don't need a lecture on composure right now," she says coolly, "not from someone who hasn't even asked if I'm okay." He exhales, caught briefly. Any retort he had dissolves, and for a moment, regret tinges his expression. "You're right," he concedes, his voice quieter now but truthful. "I didn't." "Are you?" She remains silent at first but finally exhales. "What does it matter? I'll always be expected to act like I'm more than okay. Regardless," she replies, gesturing vaguely toward the diners who continue to feign disinterest. "Public perception is all people like me are allowed to own, isn't it?" Her words land with precision, and the man shifts, visibly uncomfortable again, but resolute not to look away from the gravity of her statement. Before he can respond, the faint ding of the restaurant door sounds once more. Heads turn sharply toward the noise, witness the return of the entitled white woman who had left mere minutes earlier. Her husband trails behind, his face a mixture of confusion and meek resignation. The woman's expression, though, is far from subdued. Striding toward the counter, she slaps what appears to be her untouched dinner receipt onto it, her indignation spilling outward as her voice rises above the calm hum that had begun to return. "I don't care who sits at your tables," she exclaims sharply, "but someone like that should learn when to go somewhere more appropriate." The outburst shatters any remaining traces of calm in the room, silencing even the faintest murmurs. For the black woman nearest to the door, time seems to slow. She grips the strap of her purse as if grounding herself. Her stranger-turned defender stiffens beside her, torn between words and action. And then, something gives. Not audibly, but visibly. The tension boils over as she steps forward, walking not outward but back into the fray. "You!" the black woman calls out, her voice cutting cleanly through the air. It's not loud, but it carries a gravitas that demands attention. Half the room leans forward, startled. Even the emboldened white woman pauses mid-protest, her head swiveling toward the speaker. "Say it," the black woman continues, taking an additional step closer. Her poise, now edged with unflinching steel, leaves no room for dismissiveness. "What you really mean, here, in front of all these people." The restaurant freezes at her challenge. The white woman stares back, initially caught off guard, but coiling into an almost forced composure, her lips twitching into a half-smirk. "What are you implying?" she asks, but there's no mistaking the script delicately hidden behind her words. Meanwhile, the servers exchange alarmed glances, sensing the inevitable collision. One of them reaches shakily for a phone beneath the counter, but pauses, hesitating as the woman's voice rises to meet the charged air. "You began this. Let's finish it. Are you willing to strip away the pretense, or will you keep hiding behind it?" The air hangs suspended in taut expectation, the weight of her demand pressing heavier with each passing second. Eyes from every corner of the restaurant shift between the two women, the room suffused with the kind of impossible stillness that feels like it could crack at any moment. A tremor of something, fear, recognition, or perhaps pride flashes across the white woman's face. But before she can form a response, the distant cry of sirens suddenly pierces the heavy atmosphere, dragging everyone's focus abruptly outward. The piercing sound of sirens draws every ear in the restaurant, demanding their attention like an uninvited overseer. The black woman stands still, her face a masterclass in restraint, yet something flickers behind her eyes, an ember, a question unspoken but not unnoticed. The entitled white woman stiffens, glancing toward the glass front of the restaurant where faint blue and red lights now pulse like a heartbeat. Across the room, a server finally fumbles her phone behind the counter, her lips mouthing an apology to no one in particular. "I thought it was getting out of control," she whispers. Yet the server next to her, a wiry man in his 20s, looks uncertain whether action was the right call. "Out of control?" "No one even raised their voice," he counters softly, but the moment for debate has passed. The restaurant door swings open abruptly, and the chill of the outside air floods in along with two uniformed officers. Their presence shifts the atmosphere. It's as though every breath within those walls now belongs to them. One officer, taller, his shoulders squared with the wearied authority of someone accustomed to rushing toward tension, scans the room briefly. His partner, shorter but equally stern, steps aside and murmurs into his shoulder radio, signaling their arrival. The entitled woman is the first to move, striding toward them as though their presence vindicates her. "Thank goodness you're here," she begins, her voice laced with exaggerated relief. "I was just trying to enjoy my meal when she gestures toward the black woman near the door, her tone shifting imperceptibly to something colder. There was unpleasantness. The officer's gaze follows her gesture, landing on the black woman, who, despite everything, stands unshaken. Every set of eyes in the room sharpens, free to cast judgment now that the theater of civility has been interrupted by authority. The taller officer signals for calm, his palm raised at chest level. "Ma'am, we were dispatched for a disturbance," he says evenly, his tone carefully neutral. "What exactly happened here?" The entitled woman hesitates, caught momentarily by the unexpected scrutiny. Her story lacks substance, and the officer's sharp professionalism seems to unnerve her slightly. "Well," she trails off briefly, recovering quickly, "it wasn't violent or anything, but I felt unsafe. And my husband?" She turns to him, but the man has retreated into himself, arms crossed, his expression sheepish and resigned. "He'll confirm it," she adds, her voice slightly less certain. The officers turn to the husband, but he doesn't speak, doesn't nod, doesn't even hold his wife's gaze. Instead, he looks to the floor, an unspoken refusal that coils tension back into the room. A faint murmur ripples among the other diners. Displeased with his inaction, the white woman's eyes narrow and her lips tighten, but before she can speak again, the black woman steps forward. "I'd like to explain," she says, her composed voice finally breaking the stalemate. It's not loud, but it carries a calm strength that cuts through the manufactured chaos. The taller officer nods, motioning for her to go on. I was sitting here, quietly. Eating, she begins, her words deliberately measured, refusing to rush, and that woman she motions toward the entitled wife made it her business to confront me, escalate over nothing, and humiliate me. Her voice catches almost imperceptibly on the word, but she pushes forward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't retaliate in kind. And yet, here we are. Around the room, the power of her words begins to pull even reluctant sympathies toward her. Servers exchange furtive looks, diners put down their utensils, and even the white woman's husband seems to visibly shrink within himself. The entitled woman, feeling the pivot in energy, reacts reflexively. "You ripped your own sleeve," she snaps, the accusation clattering in the sudden quiet like a dropped plate. I don't know what she's trying to get here, but it's attention, clearly. This time, murmurs grow louder, but it's the suited man. The black woman's dining companion who speaks next. He steps forward unapologetically, his voice calm but unyielding. "You've been hostile since the moment you saw her sitting there. This, officer, is why you were called. Not for a real disturbance, but for this woman's discomfort at sharing space." A ripple of agreement follows his words, subtle nods from previously indifferent diners who now find themselves swept into the narrative. The taller officer observes the shifting tides, his expression unreadable but quietly evaluating. "Is there anyone else who can corroborate?" he asks, his tone pragmatic but unconsciously inviting a response. At first, silence reigns. No one wants to be the first to volunteer. But then, the wiry young server from behind the counter breaks rank. "I saw it," he says haltingly, stepping forward. "She didn't do anything wrong. It's all like she said." This validation tips the mood decisively. Though it angers the entitled woman, her voice rises again, but the words that come out are not the ones she intends. In her frustration, she sneers, "Well, we all know how these people like to turn minor problems into full-blown ordeals." The restaurant collectively inhales sharply. If the atmosphere had been tense before, it now simmers on the edge of eruption. The shorter officer, finally breaking his silence, speaks with a tone unmistakably edged with warning. "Ma'am, you need to stop talking." His words have weight, a suggestion carrying the force of order, and they bring the entitled woman to an abrupt halt. By now, even she can see it. She's lost the room. The power she thought she held through performance has collapsed under the scrutiny of an audience that no longer believes her act. The silence compresses around her, suffocating, though she casts wild looks for an escape. And then, as if punctuating the moment, the restaurant door chime rings. But this time, no one looks. All eyes remain fixed in the charged present, where the officers stand as the arbiters of unfolding justice, their next steps weighted with expectation and consequence. The red and blue lights outside pulse against the glass, the visual echo of the sirens fading as the officers inside shift uncomfortably in the scrutiny of dozens of diners. The restaurant feels alive, teetering on the edge of chaos. At the center of it all is the black woman, standing across from the white woman whose words have weaponized civility into a thinly veiled assault. The officers, their presence intended to stabilize, seem caught off guard by the sheer weight of the moment. It's not about the facts, but the dynamics of battle unspoken but vividly felt. The taller officer's jaw tightens as he weighs the narratives presented to him. He scans the room again, unwilling to rush yet visibly cautious of the possibility that any move he makes may escalate what he was called to de-escalate. His partner, still stationed near the door, takes a step forward but says nothing, observing instead the chessboard of power playing out before him. This isn't about a torn dress. This, he realizes, has layers far deeper than the words exchanged. The black woman exhales slowly, measuring her words carefully, though the fire in her eyes betrays the emotions coiled tightly beneath her composure. "I want to make one thing very clear," she begins. Her voice neither raises nor softens. Its controlled intensity cuts the silence like a blade. "This isn't the first time someone like her tried to make someone like me feel small, but I will not shrink for her comfort. Not today, not ever again." The statement hovers in the air, filling every crevice of the restaurant with its resonant authority. Even the diners who had stayed silent, their heads dipped in quiet complicity moments earlier, are now visibly invested in the mounting crescendo of the moment. A woman at a far corner table, middle-aged and white, shifts audibly in her seat, her discomfort apparent. She stops herself mid-thought from giving voice to her mind, aware that any ill-considered remark might spark a backlash she isn't prepared to face. But it's the dining companion of the black woman, the tailored suit man, who breaks rank and speaks next. His tone is calm, almost pitying, as he addresses the officers directly. "You know what this is, don't you?" he asks, not accusatory but rhetorical. The taller officer meets his gaze but doesn't reply. "This wasn't a call about safety," the man continues. "This was about control, about someone feeling entitled to decide who gets to exist comfortably in this space." The entitlement recipient, the white woman, fumbles visibly, her earlier composure cracking like fragile porcelain under the heat of the words now directed at her. She redirects her venom toward the dining companion, thrusting a pointed finger his way. "And who are you to tell them what to think?" she spits. "How dare you stand there and call me a liar?" This accusation doesn't land the way she intends. It lacks force. Her words seem brittle, like she herself is on the verge of crumbling under a pressure she can no longer direct outward with confidence. The tailored suit man doesn't reply directly, opting instead for a glance toward his companion, meeting her eyes as if silently reassuring her of unspoken solidarity. The officers exchange subtle looks as the tension shifts, no longer tethered solely to the women, but expanding to encompass the entire room. The wiry server who had spoken earlier clears his throat, jolting the room with the unexpected interruption. "I think it's pretty clear who's been causing the real disturbance here," he says softly but not uncertainly, glancing toward the officers. His words, though measured, land decisively. A murmur of agreement ripples faintly among a few diners, punctuating his statement in small but poignant degrees. Faced with an audience that has already passed its judgment, the officers visibly shift their approach. The taller one, stepping slightly forward, locks his gaze on the entitled woman. "Ma'am," he says, voice firm but diplomatic, "it seems like this situation has escalated unnecessarily. I recommend you leave peacefully before this gets any worse." The white woman's cheeks flush instantly. "Leave? Me? You're telling me I'm the problem here?" Her voice rises, growing shrill and defensive, but there is no energy in the room to validate her indignation anymore. Not even from her husband, whose eyes are now cast downward, avoiding everyone's gaze, most especially hers. Before the officer can reply, the black woman takes a step closer, drawing all attention back to her and away from the entitled woman's unraveling outburst. "You should leave," she says quietly but with finality. Her composure doesn't waver, though her tone now carries a command that makes it impossible for her opponent to disregard. For a moment, no one speaks. The entitled woman's lips tighten, her nostrils flaring as the reality of the situation finally crashes into her with unrelenting clarity. No ally remains at her side. Not the officers, not her husband, not the crowd who had once been content to look away. And as her gaze darts nervously through the room, searching desperately for some footing, she finds none. Feeling trapped, she scoffs loudly, a noise that might have been intended as defiance but comes off as weak and cornered. Without another word, she grabs her bag and storms toward the door, her heels clicking harshly against the wooden floor. Her husband, wordlessly, follows. The bell chimes behind them. It feels like the first breath the room has taken in minutes. But the departing hostility isn't the end of the scene. Not quite. The black woman doesn't return to her seat. Instead, she remains standing, her presence grounded yet commanding. She doesn't need words, not now. The silence in the restaurant carries the weight of her triumphant victory, muted but unmistakable. And while the officers remain a few steps away, hesitant to pronounce their task complete, the black woman turns to her dining companion. There are no smiles exchanged between them. This isn't a moment for relief, it's something far more complex. The battle was fought, a line was drawn, but the war, they both know, is far from over. Just as she begins to sit down once again, her hands trembling faintly now that the adrenaline has begun to wane, a sudden flash of shadow crosses the restaurant window, a figure outside moving deliberately toward the door. The bell chimes again, turning every head toward the re-entering presence. It's not the entitled woman or her husband. It's someone new. The bell chimes again, and the room collectively hushes. Every strained breath, every shadowed glance, and every coil of tension remains frozen as the next wave of this interwoven narrative makes its entrance. A new figure steps inside. Clad in casual but confident attire, the newcomer is a young black man in his late 20s. His jeans and navy blue jacket are unremarkable, but there's something in his posture that commands attention. Shoulders back, chin subtly lifted, a calm awareness that sets him apart the moment he crosses the threshold. He pauses in the doorway, surveying the scene with the sharpness of someone who hasn't missed the thick atmosphere pooling in the room. The officers glance at him, brows furrowing slightly, as if they too are recalibrating to this unforeseen entrant. His gaze briefly meets the black woman's, an almost imperceptible flicker of recognition passing between them, though neither offers an overt acknowledgement. The younger officer steps toward the man, cautious but professional. "Sir, this is a private matter. Do you have business here?" His voice carries no hostility, but rather the weariness of someone determined to maintain order. The young man doesn't flinch under the attention. His reply is steady, unhurried. "I'm meeting someone," he says, glancing past the officers toward the black woman standing near the door. His words, though simple, feel weighted like a stone dropped in still water to gauge its depth. The nod he gives her is slight, nearly imperceptible, yet it says enough. She shifts subtly, her fingers loosening slightly from the tight grip on her purse strap as she exhales a breath she didn't realize she was holding. The dining companion, now seated but following the moment closely, straightens in his chair as though trying to assess whether this newly arrived man is friend or unspoken adversary. The entitled white woman, still within earshot and simmering not far from the restaurant's exit with her husband awkwardly hovering nearby, glares at the newcomer. "Oh, great," she mutters audibly, though not quite loudly enough to fully command attention. It's a failed attempt to summon the support she no longer has. The younger officer's stance relaxes slightly but keeps a layer of professional skepticism. A subtle glance to his colleague affirms that the stranger, at least for now, presents no discernible threat. His posture remains calm but unyielding. He is a man who demands clarity but without aggression. "May I ask your name?" the officer inquires, casual authority woven into his even tone. The young man exhales, just as steady. "Marcus," he answers simply. Then, more deliberately, he shifts his gaze toward the black woman again. This time he adds, "And I'd like to sit with her for a moment, if she's okay with that." This request ignites a ripple of intrigue among the diners, each of them leaning forward slightly, their discomfort momentarily eclipsed by curiosity. The black woman doesn't answer immediately. Her inner conflict flashes briefly in her demeanor, flickering between exhaustion and guardedness, but something in Marcus's poise, his quiet certitude, seems to disarm her. At last she nods once. There is no triumph in her agreement, only an acknowledgement that perhaps for this fleeting moment, she doesn't have to navigate this hostile landscape alone. Marcus takes careful, deliberate steps toward her table, his presence anchoring the erratic energy in the room. The older officer watches carefully, still stationed near the window but opts not to intervene. As Marcus pulls out a chair and sits beside her, his posture casual but engaged, the entitled white woman's festering outrage breaks its simmer. "This is ridiculous," she announces sharply. Her voice shatters the fragile balance in the room like glass hitting concrete. "You're just going to let this," she gestures vaguely with an erratic sweep of her hand, "go on as if we don't all see what's really happening?" The taller officer, now visibly irritated, raises his hand for silence. "Ma'am," he says with an air of finality, "you've been asked to leave, and unless you'd like to escalate this into something far more serious, I suggest you do so now." His tone leaves no room for negotiation, and the white woman stares, stunned into silence for a moment. Beside her, her husband lowers his head further, as though willing the earth to swallow him whole. Defeated but not humbled, she turns with a muttered, "Unbelievable." Her exit is swift, her heels clacking against the hardwood in clipped frustration until the door swings shut behind her. Her husband follows, his capitulated silence a ghost trailing behind him. And just like that, the room exhales. The lingering embers of tension no longer burn as fiercely, though they still radiate heat. Marcus leans forward, speaking low enough that his voice carries only to the woman beside him. "I'm sorry it came to this," he says. His tone is genuine, unguarded, a rare vulnerability in a world that demands his constant fortification. She looks at him for a long moment, as though weighing whether to accept the sentiment or brush it aside. Ultimately, she nods faintly, but her composure remains sharp. "This isn't new," she replies, her voice quieter now, though it still carries an undeniable weight. "It never is." Marcus starts to respond but is interrupted when one of the servers tentatively steps forward, a pitcher of water held as though it were a peace offering. Her voice trembles slightly as she offers, "Is there anything I can get for you both?" The question hangs in the air, its simplicity unintentionally loaded. For the black woman, it feels like an olive branch extended too late but extended nonetheless. She looks at Marcus, who nods subtly. Turning back to the server, she finally speaks. "We'll take a minute." The server hesitates, then nods quickly before retreating. Around the room, diners resume their meals, though the weight of what unfolded remains palpable. Conversations are muted, careful, and at the center of it all, Marcus and the black woman sit in a fragile moment of shared understanding, their presence a quiet defiance against the forces that sought to diminish them. But just as the tension eases, a figure lingers at the window outside. Though they remain half-hidden, their silhouette is unmistakably deliberate. The bell hasn't rung this time, yet the sense of intrusion and perhaps a new danger creeps back into the room like an unwelcome chill. Marcus sits now opposite the woman in the burgundy dress, their table a small island in the sea of unfinished meals and averted gazes. The quiet hum of resumed conversations barely fills the room, as though the restaurant itself remains wary, hesitant to fully exhale. The woman doesn't look at Marcus directly, her eyes fixed instead on a tiny chip in the table's surface. The subtleties of wear and damage seem oddly appropriate after the night's events. Marcus, ever composed, notices her silence. He doesn't rush to fill it. For now, he remains patient, allowing the weight of the atmosphere and the gravity of what's been both endured and avoided to settle naturally. The officers linger by the entrance, one leaning slightly toward the other for a hushed exchange. Their postures are relaxed enough to suggest they've deemed the situation under control, but tense enough to signal they haven't fully let their guard down. Finally, Marcus breaks the silence between them. His voice is soft but deliberate. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he says, gesturing faintly toward the black woman before him, "but I couldn't let you leave without letting you know you're not alone." Her lips press into a thin line for a moment, an almost involuntary reaction to his words. Though her gaze remains fixed downward, she can't fully prevent the tremor of emotion flickering behind her composed demeanor. When she finally responds, her words are measured, cautious, as though every syllable must be evaluated for how much it reveals. And what difference does that make? Even when someone stays, who's to say they won't leave when it matters most? Her tone isn't accusatory, but the vulnerability within it is stark. Marcus hesitates, his brow furrowing slightly as he processes the implicit hurt in her response. "Your husband," he says carefully, not as a question but as an observation hanging in the space between them. She doesn't answer immediately, the lump in her throat a tangible obstacle. "He left because staying would have been harder for him," she says at last, her voice flat but carrying a force beneath it. "Easier to walk away than stand in someone else's storm. Doesn't matter if the storm is yours." Marcus leans forward slightly, his hands clasped together on the table before him. "That storm isn't yours," he replies, his tone firm. "It belongs to anyone who enables it, lets it grow while telling themselves they did nothing wrong." He leans back slightly, softening his expression. "It's not yours to carry, not alone." For the first time, she looks directly at him. There's skepticism in her gaze, but also something more, a flicker of hope trying desperately to push through the weight of disillusionment. Marcus holds her gaze steadily, refusing to shy away from her scrutiny. Nearby, a couple from a corner table finally rises to leave. Their departure is quiet but calculated, meant to slip away unnoticed, though nothing about the scene truly allows for it. The woman at the table watches them leave out of the corner of her eye, her lips curling into a slight, sardonic smile. "That's who I am to them," she says, almost to herself but loud enough for Marcus to hear. A reminder of what they don't want to acknowledge. Something they'd rather excuse themselves from. She exhales deeply before adding, "I suppose people like me aren't good for digestion." Marcus tilts his head slightly, his expression sharp but not unkind. "I don't think you give yourself enough credit." He pauses, glancing briefly around the restaurant before speaking again. "You walked back in. You didn't have to, but you did, and because of that, you made people see what they wanted to avoid. You didn't let their silence swallow you, even if it tried to." Her eyes widen slightly at his words, though her skepticism doesn't fully dissipate. "I'm not some symbol," she counters quietly, almost reflexively. "I'm just a person, a tired, exhausted person who's sick of." Before she can finish, the restaurant door swings open once more. Heads turn instinctively toward the sound, their attention magnetized by the third presence now entering the space. The figure in the doorway isn't imposing, but his arrival carries an undeniable air of disruption. The man is older, perhaps in his late 40s. His uniform, security, not police, is neatly pressed but clearly worn from frequent use. His face, sharp and lined with the weight of authority, scans the room quickly. It's him who the black woman sees first, and her momentary confusion quickly resolves into wariness. The security officer walks purposefully toward the two uniformed officers still stationed at the door. His voice, though not loud, carries enough gravity to carry across much of the room. "What's going on here?" Dispatch called for an update. The taller officer steps forward slightly, replying in a tone tinged with annoyance, but also deference for protocol. "Situation's under control. The disturbance resolved itself." His words are intentionally vague, but the security officer doesn't seem satisfied. "So why are you still here?" the man asks bluntly, his gaze now cutting toward the black woman and Marcus sitting near the center of the room. His scrutiny lingers, assessing, calculating. "We're just making sure," the other officer replies, crossing his arms over his chest. "No sense in rushing out if things can turn back up again." The security officer doesn't react immediately, his focus shifting fully onto the black woman. His intentions remain obscured, his posture unreadable. "You," he starts, his deep voice commanding the black woman's attention, a word outside. The room chills, the tension reigniting almost instantly as every soul waits to see whether this is yet another escalation, another chapter in a seemingly endless ordeal of scrutiny and challenge. The black woman's eyes narrow, but she doesn't immediately rise. Marcus, however, straightens in his seat, his gaze locked on the security officer as though daring him to step out of line. The cliffhanger hangs like a blade. The next choice, a fraught and pivotal one for everyone watching, and most especially for her. Marcus's eyes remain intently locked on the security officer as the room grows heavy under the weight of this new confrontation. By now, most conversations have ceased altogether, with diners reduced to mere spectators once again. The black woman does not speak immediately, her expression unreadable, but her posture is rigid, ready for whatever comes next. The security officer's command, however simply phrased, carries undertones that everyone in the restaurant picks up on. It isn't just a request, it's a demand. A subtle testing of boundaries under the guise of authority. "Outside," he repeats, voice unwavering, though his narrowed stare betrays a readiness to meet resistance. Marcus's hands press firmly against the table, as though bracing himself from bolting upright. A low, quiet warning escapes his lips. She doesn't need to go anywhere. His voice is controlled, but the tension within it draws the eyes of even the silent patrons watching. It's less a statement of defiance and more a protective instinct, radiating from every fiber of his being. The taller uniformed officer angles his body toward Marcus, his voice measured but carrying an ounce of irritation. "We're trying to keep this from escalating further, sir. Let's not make it harder than it needs to be." His words are directed at Marcus, but his eyes briefly flicker toward the black woman, assessing her response or lack thereof. For the first time, she breaks her silence. Her voice is calm, steady, yet brimming with a quiet anger. "Why outside? If you have something to say it here." Her words slice through the air like a scalpel, leaving no room for ambiguity. Her gaze, sharp and unyielding, meets the security officer's. She makes no effort to shrink, no instinctive move to placate. Instead, her challenge hangs in the silence like a gauntlet thrown. The diners exchange uneasy glances. The earlier tension, briefly diffused by the entitled woman's departure, is now reigniting in a new form. This confrontation feels less petty, more consequential, like a moment that could shift the very atmosphere of the room. The security officer, clearly not expecting pushback, tilts his head slightly, assessing her with renewed scrutiny. "Ma'am," he begins, false politeness coating his tone, "I'm just following protocol. We handle these matters away from the public eye." "And yet," Marcus interjects, his voice cutting through with precision, "you walked into this room publicly with your badge, your authority, and your gaze fixed on her. So why does this need to be private now?" The security officer stiffens but doesn't immediately respond. His focus shifts briefly to the two uniformed officers as though expecting support, but neither moves to intervene. The taller officer, clearly eager to avoid yet another escalation, exhales loudly through his nose but says nothing. His silence speaks volumes, and for once, the security officer seems unsure of his next move. The black woman shifts in her seat, drawing the room's gaze back to her. Her movements are deliberate, her composure unwavering despite the circumstances. "You're not following protocol," she says finally. "There's no protocol here. What you're doing is intimidating, plain and simple." Her tone remains calm, and in the quiet that follows, a faint murmur of agreement ripples through the room. Diners who had previously averted their eyes now watch her with something resembling admiration, though none speak aloud. The security officer's jaw ticks. He squares his shoulders and takes a step forward, standing just close enough to radiate authority but far enough to avoid outright hostility. His voice drops lower, almost threateningly. "You can make this easy, or you can make this hard. Your choice." Marcus finally leans back in his chair, his movements slow and deliberate as though gauging every shift in the energy of the room. "It's her choice, all right," he says evenly, "but not in the way you're implying. She doesn't owe you or anyone anything, least of all compliance for the sake of your so-called comfort." The two men lock eyes, their unspoken challenge crackling in the air between them. For a moment it feels as though nothing else in the room exists. But then the black woman stands, her movements razor-sharp with purpose. Every head in the restaurant turns instinctively toward her. "You want me to step outside?" she asks coldly, her eyes boring into the security officers as though daring him to confirm. There's no hesitation in her voice, no hint of retreat. In fact, her challenge dismantles his authority layer by unrelenting layer. "Then lead the way." Marcus stiffens at her words, his hand gripping the edge of the table as though ready to intervene. But he doesn't. The restraint costs him visibly, the tension in his jaw betraying his inner conflict. He knows better than to undermine her agency, but every bone in his body cries against letting her face this alone. The security officer blinks, momentarily caught off guard by her boldness. He falters, if only for a split second, and that is all it takes for the tables to metaphorically tilt in her favor. As she steps toward him calm, deliberate, he instinctively takes a step back, his confidence visibly shaken. The restaurant holds its collective breath, diners perched on the edge of their seats. Even the officers by the doorway seem unsure of how to proceed, their instincts warring against their training. And then, just as the black woman reaches the security officer's side, her voice slices through the fragile silence. "You can keep trying to turn people like me into problems," she says softly, dangerously, "but the real issue has always been people like you." Her words, quiet as they are, land like a thunderclap. The security officer stiffens further, his jaw tightening, but he doesn't reply. For the first time, it's evident to everyone in the room, the power has shifted. And then the restaurant door swings open yet again, the outside air cutting sharply into the room. The incoming figure is shadowed against the light, their identity obscured but their presence undeniable. Every eye shifts toward the new arrival, anticipation crackling like electricity in the air as the story takes yet another unexpected turn. The security officer's lingering hesitation is palpable, and for a beat, the black woman's words seem to render him frozen. Around the restaurant, an unwieldy silence thickens, each pair of eyes oscillating between her resolute stance and the imposing figure now left without a definitive course of action. The tension turns brittle, the kind that feels as if it will fracture at the slightest misstep. Yet, it's the door that slices through this mounting unease with a creak, revealing the shadowed figure who had entered seconds earlier. They stand fully in the frame, now a man of average build, his plain dark coat smudged with dirt and his expression unreadable. Strands of his hair fall into his eyes as he deliberately scans the room. The officers' postures shift collectively toward him, not abruptly, but enough to betray an unsettled readiness to act. The security officer's focus snaps away from the black woman to evaluate this latest disruption. The man in the doorway pays no heed to any of them. His gaze, like an unrelenting current, flows straight to the black woman. There's something about the way he looks at her, not as though he recognizes her, but as if she, or perhaps what she represents, is precisely why he's here. "Is there a problem?" the man asks, his voice gravelly but calm, filling the air before anyone can respond. He takes a step forward. It's not aggressive, not intentional, but it sends the officers into a subconscious defensive adjustment, their taut grips flexing near their belts. Marcus rises from his chair first, placing himself ever so slightly between the newcomer and the black woman. His body language is guarded, his movements deliberate but wary. "Who are you?" Marcus asks, tone clipped but steady. There's a chill to his question, not suspicious but signaling that the room is already wound too tight for further surprises. The man takes another step forward, lifting his hands in a show of nonchalance rather than surrender. "Easy," he says, "not here to start anything." Then, locking eyes with Marcus, he continues, "I couldn't help but notice the scene. Sound carries out there." He nods vaguely toward the street beyond the glass hard to miss. "Just thought maybe someone could use a witness." Eyes dart around the restaurant, calculating and cautious. A few diners exchange doubtful glances, their half-raised brows bordering skepticism. The black woman, still standing firm but now with Marcus closer to her side, doesn't immediately respond to him. Instead, her gaze narrows slightly in assessment, probing for motive beneath his offer. "What's your name?" one of the uniformed officers finally asks, stepping forward enough to assert his fraying authority over the expanding dynamic. "James," the man replies briskly, though he doesn't follow with a surname. "I'm just here to vouch for what she says, if it really comes to that." He jerks his chin subtly toward the black woman. "Didn't seem fair what I heard." The security officer exhales audibly this time, a sharp burst of air that seems fueled equally by frustration and the attempt to reclaim control of the room. "Sir," he says firmly, keeping his tone measured, "if you don't have direct involvement in this situation, I'm going to need you to leave." James smirks faintly, shifting his weight onto one leg. "And if I say what I saw from out there is involved enough?" He counters lightly but with unmistakable undercurrent. There's something unsettlingly steady in his tone, a tightrope of composure that has just enough tension to hint he won't be easily dismissed. The taller uniformed officer clears his throat, cutting a glance toward the security officer before addressing James directly. "Sir, we appreciate your concern, but things were already under control here. Unless there's a direct tie to what occurred, it's best you let us wrap this thing up." Before James can respond, which he very clearly intends to do, the black woman finally steps in. Her voice is sharp enough to cleave through the competing presences now encircling her. "No one can explain what I've endured here better than me," she declares, bringing the full weight of the room's attention back to her. "And I don't need interruptions to my own story." Her directness lands heavier than an accusation. Marcus shrinks slightly to her side, though he doesn't retreat, while James bows his head briefly in acknowledgement. "Fair enough," he utters softly, his posture relaxing with a restrained deference. Yet, rather than leave, he steps toward a table by the wall, distanced but still present. He gestures toward a waiter before sitting, signaling he's willing to stay as an observer but not an agitator. The implicit victory shifts some energy back to the woman. She doesn't sit, won't perhaps, but her presence feels less cornered now, more centered. Under control, she repeats sharply now, her words aimed deliberately at the officers. "You keep saying this situation is under control, like something was spiraling, but let me ask this. Who here was spiraling? Do I look out of control, or am I simply inconvenient?" A beat passes, the rhetorical question drawing no answer, because none could justify her point being asked in the first place. The taller officer exhales slowly and straightens to his full height. "Ma'am," he starts, the patronizing tone of authority clipped by fatigue, "no one's accusing you." "Oh, really?" She cuts in, unwavering, her brow lifting slightly. Her voice doesn't rise, still deliberate, still composed. Then what was his demand to step outside about? Was that concern? Does concern come with vague warnings and officious stares? Her words hang there, embedding deeply in those who absorb them. A slight movement from the kitchen end distracts a sliver of the room's attention. It's a server, clearly unsure of where to walk or focus as her eyes sweep the unfolding fractures in silence. Nervous energy rebounds from civilian to authority figure, but the black woman doesn't waver. "Maybe," she continues, directing her razor-sharp gaze back to the officers, "it's the ones you think need quieting who've been loud enough in their actions, their consequences, for decades." James, seated quietly across now, tilts his head just slightly, approving without a word. Marcus stands taller again, perhaps buoyed by her assertion. The tension, now smoldering rather than choking, seems inclined to shift, but the story has yet to tip entirely in any direction. The black woman straightens fully now as another light shuffle begins toward the entrance. The bell rings faintly again, and eyes dart to determine if fresh air or love carries whoever steps in next. A faint gust of cold air brushes through the restaurant as the door swings shut behind the latest arrival. Every pair of eyes turns toward the black woman and the security officer in the center of the room, as if the entire dining area is collectively holding its breath. Yet nothing moves. Every aspect of this standoff feels stretched to its breaking point, a precarious balance between restraint and eruption. The tension ripples outward, undeniable and alive. The black woman stands tall, her posture a masterclass in calm defiance, her eyes like twin blades fixed on the man meant to intimidate her. The security officer shifts uneasily, his earlier confidence visibly eroding under her unyielding gaze. The officers near the door exchange quick, silent glances. At this point, the disruption no longer feels like something they can resolve neatly. It's a powder keg waiting for the final strike. Marcus, still standing beside the woman, shifts subtly forward, close enough to signify his solidarity but never overshadowing her. His eyes flick briefly to the newly arrived figure sitting quietly by the wall. James, steady and attentive, watches everything unfold with the kind of focus that suggests he's calculating every possible course of action. If there's an invisible fault line dividing the room, James is on one side while the security officer teeters uncertainly on the other. "You can escort yourself out," the black woman states, her voice level yet firm. Direct, uncompromising. Her words are like a bright flare searing through the smoke of this moment. She takes a faint step closer to the security officer, never breaking eye contact. "Because it's clear you're not here to help. You're here to disrupt, to dominate, to put me in my place. But here's the problem with that. Your place isn't above mine." Every word she speaks seems to echo, amplified by the hushed silence of the room. Even the diners who had previously looked down or away now keep their attention squarely on her. Some seem unable to believe her audacity. Others perhaps are quietly rooting for her presence to prevail, emboldened by her clarity, her refusal to falter. The security officer's jaw tightens. He looks around, scanning for any sign of external validation, perhaps from the uniformed officers, the diners, anyone. But the other officers don't step in, their stolid silence practically carved from stone. The diners' faces offer no sanctuary. At best, they are neutral witnesses. At worst, the earlier murmurs of support for the black woman betray his isolation. Still, his pride keeps him rooted. "That's enough," the security officer finally growls, stepping slightly forward. His attempt at authority, however, feels hollow. It's power for power's sake, brittle and unconvincing. "You've escalated this situation long enough. Go back to your seat now." Her laughter is unexpected. Not loud or mocking, but sharp and biting, a single sound that cuts through his fragile pretense of control. She speaks again with that same steady calm, clearly unshaken by his words or proximity. "Let me see if I understand you show up. Decide I'm the problem without knowing anything, and then demand I sit quietly like nothing happened? That's the resolution you're offering?" She lets the words hang as her eyes scan the room deliberately, catching the faces of nearby diners. "Should I shrink too? Smile and thank you while I do it?" Her rhetorical questions land like small detonations, and even Marcus seems moved. "You're going to have to do better than that," she concludes pointedly, her voice steel-cloaked in silk. The security officer falters again, taking a step back. Emboldened, her momentum grows. With one final glance at him, she steps past him entirely, moving toward her original seat. The movement itself feels like a symbolic overthrow of the entire confrontation, defying the expectation that she'd retreat or cede ground. The taller uniformed officer, sensing the shift in dynamics, steps forward, addressing both the security man and the black woman with a deliberate calm. "I think it's time we wrap this up," he says, his tone a careful balance between measured authority and cautious neutrality. There's no need for anyone else to escalate. It's Marcus who responds first. "Escalate? She's the only one here handling herself with control," he says firmly, his voice edged with tempered indignation. "She's been de-escalating since the moment you walked in." The precision of Marcus's statement seems to strip away the officer's carefully constructed neutrality. For a beat, no one speaks. Meanwhile, James, sitting quietly by the wall, raises a hand as if requesting permission to interject. Somehow, his casual gesture draws attention quickly. When he speaks, his words carry the weight of someone who's seen this story play out before, but is determined to push it toward a different ending. "Officers," he begins, his voice steady and deliberate, "don't let this get worse by chasing the wrong target here. You didn't answer a call because someone ate dinner quietly at their table. You're here because someone chose to make this about more than that. Focus on that." The security officer scoffs audibly, but before he can retort, the black woman raises one hand, not commanding silence but claiming it. Her palm up, her voice assured, she simply states, "Let him go." She's staring directly at the security officer, but her words cut broader. Everyone in the restaurant, including the officers, is forced to confront what these words imply. She doesn't need punishment or small victories. Her statement rises above that. The security officer shifts uncomfortably, then finally, exhaling sharply, mutters, "Fine." It's clear he considers this move as retreating with what little dignity remains. He steps back, his presence no longer omnipresent and stifling in the space. The officers by the doorway hesitate before following the lead of their deflated counterpart. They exchange glances, then nod slowly. The taller man speaks first. "Ma'am, if you're okay staying, we'll head out now," he says lightly, though there's no mistaking the thin layer of relief coating his tone. At first, she doesn't respond. Instead, she looks to Marcus, then to James, who gives her a faint nod of acknowledgement. Only then does she speak. "I'll be fine," she says, the next words almost feeling like a gust of fresh air reclaiming itself. "Thank you." And then, as the officers exit, the door closing behind them, she finally exhales slowly, an audible release of tension that spreads throughout the room. But just as the quiet begins to return and the diners cautiously pick up their cutlery or sip their drinks, a child's voice somewhere near the back bounces off the walls with only one unexpected, innocuous word. "Why?" The room turns, startled, and the voice, soft but insistent, suggests this story? The muted buzz of the fluorescent lights above seemed to synchronize with the room's collective exhaustion. The restaurant, though returning to its semblance of mundane operations, simmered with an energy that refused to fully dissipate. Chairs creaked softly as diners repositioned themselves, and utensils clinked occasionally against plates, though most were forgotten in half-finished meals. For all the normalcy rehearsed in these seemingly routine actions, the heavy silence spoke louder than any whispered conversation. Everyone was waiting for what no one could quite name, but they could feel it. The black woman, dressed in her now slightly torn burgundy dress, lowered herself into her seat purposefully. Her dining companion, Marcus, remained standing beside the table, his stance protective but not overbearing. She didn't ask for him to sit, she didn't need to. Her own presence, steady and deliberate as ever, commanded enough weight for both of them. Her hand lightly grazed the fabric at her side, her fingers ghosting over the tear as if to remind herself of everything that had transpired in the past hour, everything she'd weathered. Across the room, James, the unexpected spectator turned participant, made no effort to hide his attentiveness. Seated near the wall, his chair angled slightly toward her, he watched like a man who understood that observation carried its own kind of power. His actions hadn't been dramatic, nor had his words been loud, but his calm reinforcement, his measured solidarity, had undeniably recalibrated the tense, polarized energy. Still, his posture remained distant. He had offered his hand to tip the scales, but had not intruded further. To everyone's collective relief, the security officer had not returned. The last the restaurant saw of him was when he had stepped outside, his authority deflated, his part in the spectacle stripped down to its futility. The uniformed officers had followed shortly after, their official presence receding as quietly as they had entered, though the echoes of their hesitation lingered. Yet even with the absence of visible conflict, the air was far from tranquil. The shift came with a subtle repositioning. Many of the diners had stopped feigning disinterest. They no longer stared blankly at their half-eaten plates. A few openly gazed toward the woman in burgundy, their expressions varying from cautious respect to tentative curiosity. One server, the wiry young man who had earlier mustered the courage to speak up, now lingered behind the counter, his eyes darting between her and Marcus as if contemplating whether to approach again. When Marcus finally did lower himself into his seat, the chair scraping softly against the floor, it felt less like an ordinary gesture and more like an intentional reclaiming of calm. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. His voice, low but composed, broke the tension that had settled between them. "Do you want to leave or stay?" The woman didn't immediately answer. She kept her focus on a small chip in the wood grain of the table, her thoughts clearly anywhere but her surroundings. For a long moment, she seemed to tune out everything: the diners, the noise, even Marcus. But then, without looking up, she opened her mouth. "I don't like being forced into decisions," she said quietly. Her words carried a weight that belied their simplicity. Lifting her gaze, she met his eyes, the depth of her exhaustion evident in her look. Every day, its choices dictated by someone else's entitlement, and when it's not them dictating, her voice trailed off, but the unfinished thought was as sharp as any spoken word. She took a deep breath before continuing. "I just wanted dinner." Marcus nodded, his expression sympathetic but not pitying. He exhaled lightly, leaning back in his chair. "Then let's finish it," he offered simply, gesturing toward the lingering remnants of their meal. It wasn't a solution, nor did it erase everything that left bruises beneath the surface, but it was an anchor nonetheless. Around them, the restaurant's rhythm began its imperfect flow again, a mix of apprehension and recovery. Servers hesitated before each approach, their movements cautious but not entirely disengaged. One waiter finally stopped at James's table, and after a brief exchange, James waved his hand dismissively, indicating he had no intention of ordering anything. His gaze remained fixed on the central table, though he continued to maintain his respectful distance as if studying the complexities of the woman's defiance. But it wasn't just James who had settled into a watchful calm. At one of the corner tables toward the back, a middle-aged couple sat whispering to each other. Their eyes flicked repeatedly toward the black woman in her chair, her bearing as if grappling with an unspoken realization. It was the woman of the pair who finally rose, clutching her handbag to her chest. She hesitated only briefly before making her way across the room. The black woman watched the approach, her posture straightening slightly, though her expression gave nothing away. Whether this interruption carried confrontation or an apology, she remained unflinchingly poised to face it. The middle-aged woman slowed as she neared, her steps faltering in the low hum of unease. At last, she stopped a few feet short of the table. The woman began, her voice trembling slightly. She glanced nervously at Marcus and then back to the black woman, visibly struggling to string her words into coherence. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what you went through. It was wrong. The apology, unprompted and halting though it was, seemed to startle even the apologizer. Standing there, clutching her bag tightly, the woman's face flushed under the weight of her own admission. Her husband remained seated at their table across the room, watching his wife's actions with an expression that hovered between admiration and anxiety. The black woman regarded her for a lingering moment, her expression unchanging. When she finally responded, her tone was even and deliberate. It's not me you need to apologize to, she said plainly, though not unkindly. It's yourself for being part of it. The woman blinked, her lips parted as if to speak again, but no further words came. With a small, almost imperceptible nod, she retreated back to her table, her cheeks still glowing as she slipped into her seat. Marcus watched the exchange in silence, his eyes flicking toward the retreating figure before returning to his companion. He didn't comment, letting the moment linger as if understanding the significance of its quiet weight. But it was in this stillness, this muttered backdrop of resigned but incomplete closure, that something new intruded. From the far side of the restaurant, near the kitchen entrance, the sharp clang of metal on tile broke the spell. Heads turned sharply toward the sound, where a server stood frozen, his tray overturned on the floor. The young man's wide eyes fixed on something or someone moving behind the kitchen's half-open swinging door. A figure in the shadows stirred, deliberately stepping closer into view. The hum of the restaurant shifts uneasily as the young server, his tray still overturned on the floor, stares wide-eyed at the swinging kitchen door. It rocks gently back and forth, the revealed figure half concealed in shadow, but deliberate in its approach. The crash of the overturned metal tray seems to echo endlessly, amplifying the weight of the moment in an already tense space. The diners freeze once more, caught again in the gravitational pull of yet another disruption, as if this story refuses to let anyone relax. The black woman in the torn burgundy dress turns her head toward the noise, her expression calm but tense, like a coiled wire awaiting the slightest spark. Marcus, seated across from her but still radiating watchful energy, subtly shifts in his chair, his posture alert. His eyes dart to evaluate the young server's reaction before landing squarely on the figure now stepping into the light. The first impression is of presence more than appearance. Medium height, stocky build, the figure is a broad-shouldered man wearing a dark apron tied loosely at the waist. His brown hair is damp with sweat, and his sleeves are rolled up past his forearms as though he's just stepped out of the heat of the kitchen. His face, weathered but hard to place by age, carries a tense neutrality that does little to explain why the server looks so rattled. Something wrong? The man's voice is low and gravelly, breaking the frozen silence in a way that feels both intrusive and oddly mundane. He looks directly at the young server, but his words aren't confined to him. They seem to fill the room, challenging anyone to deny the authority they carry. No, nothing, the server stutters, his voice barely audible as he scrambles to gather the tray and utensils scattered about him. But his hands shake just enough to betray him, and by now, all eyes are fixed on the man from the kitchen. For a moment, the atmosphere pauses in limbo. The man with the dark apron seems almost unaffected by the weight of attention now directed at him. His head tilts slightly, his sharp, methodical gaze scanning the room the way a butcher sizes up his cuts. His eyes seem to linger briefly on the black woman's table, his expression unreadable, before they shift again. "I heard there was some kind of trouble out here." His tone is just light enough to pretend at innocence, but carries an undercurrent that snaps at the pretense. He steps further into the dining area now, his apron brushing against the tops of his thighs, and the door behind him flutters one last time before falling still. "Everyone all right?" The black woman doesn't respond immediately, but her posture shifts slightly, her shoulders squaring as her composure tightens like armor. Marcus is the first to speak, his words deliberate and even. "It's fine now," he says, though the defensive edge in his tone draws a quick look from the man. "Is it?" The apron-clad man's eyes narrow slightly, and now his gaze locks fully on Marcus. He doesn't inch closer, but doesn't need to. His mere presence is daring enough. "Because from what I've been told..." He glances pointedly at the counter where the wiry server now tries desperately to appear small. "It sounds like everything here is far from fine." "It's under control," Marcus replies, firmer this time. His voice doesn't rise, but there's a finality to it, a carefully measured command to back off without escalating. The tension between the two men hangs precariously, as if the slightest shift could send both hurtling into confrontation. The black woman finally breaks her silence. "If you're here to help," she interjects sharply, her calm voice slicing cleanly into the space between them, "then help. If not, there's no need to make this worse." She meets his gaze head-on, her tone unflinching in its challenge. The man seems taken aback, just barely, but recovers quickly. "Making it worse?" he echoes, almost amused. "I'm just trying to make sure everyone understands how we do things here. Can't have misunderstandings, right?" He looks around as if seeking validation, but the unspoken message in his tone is clear. He's not here to mediate. The quiet muttering of a few diners ripples faintly through the room. Though the restaurant has seen its share of shifting dynamics throughout the night, this new presence feels less like a resolution and more like a new powder keg being brought into the room. James, seated silently at his table by the wall, leans forward slightly, his sharp eyes fixed on the exchange. He hasn't spoken since he set himself apart, but his presence remains weighted, like an anchor waiting to be dropped. "Misunderstandings happen when people overstep," Marcus says finally, his words laced with quiet resolve. He leans forward in his chair now, matching the man's deliberate pace of delivery. "So maybe it's best to let the people here finish their evening and step back." The man doesn't immediately respond, though his jaw tightens incrementally, small cracks showing in his previously impenetrable demeanor. But whatever retort is forming on his lips dies the moment the black woman stands from her chair. "It was made clear earlier," she says, her voice calm yet weightier now, "that I'm not leaving until I choose to. And if you're here to tell me otherwise," her gaze pierces his like a blade, "then I suggest you save your breath." The room falls silent again, her words ringing out with a gravity that demands attention. The man's face hardens, but he doesn't step closer. For the first time since entering the dining room, his certainty wavers, briefly but undeniably. As the moment stretches thin, everyone waits to see what will break first, his resolve or the fragile calm that now blankets the space. And then, in the far corner of the room, another sound disrupts the stillness. The scrape of a chair on the wooden floor, a subtle but deliberate movement. All heads swivel toward the source, where an older man, gray-haired and bespectacled, finally rises from his seat. He adjusts the sleeves of his sweater as he stands, taking his time before addressing the room. "If I might say something," the older man begins, his soft but confident voice cutting through the silence. "It seems to me," he pauses, his eyes sweeping from the black woman to the kitchen man and back, "that this situation has gone on long enough." The older man's voice carries a calm authority, cutting through the tension like a steady hand slicing through stormy waters. He adjusts his glasses as he surveys the room, his posture unassuming yet resolute. His tone isn't loud or demanding, but it carries a weight that immediately commands attention. All eyes shift to him, breaking the standoff between the man in the apron and the black woman. "I've been sitting here," he begins, his words deliberate and measured, "watching all this unfold, observing, as many of us have." His gaze sweeps over the diners, his statement implicating their complicity without malice. "And I have to say, this has gone too far." The words land like a quiet challenge, leaving the room suspended in an uneasy silence. The man in the apron, whose confidence already wavered, shifts on his feet, his eyes narrowing as he evaluates this new intrusion. Still, he doesn't speak. The black woman stands motionless by her chair, her calm exterior a stark contrast to the volcanic energy simmering beneath the surface. James, by the wall, leans forward in his seat, his focused gaze on the older man as if studying the shift in dynamics. Marcus sits rigid at the table, his jaw tightening, but he doesn't speak. This moment belongs, for now, to someone else. "I have lived long enough," the older man continues, his voice gaining a quiet steel, "to recognize when something is not about what it pretends to be. And this, here," he gestures loosely around the room, "is not about a spilled tray or a disagreement about space. It's about power and fear and control." He pauses, letting his words settle. "And it is shameful." The word shameful cuts sharply through the room. The diners, who had resumed quiet conversations or stolen glances at their meals, now sit frozen. The young server, still trembling by the counter, looks down at his shoes, his expression caught between guilt and relief that someone else has taken the stage. The black woman finally raises her chin slightly, a flicker of emotion crossing her features, perhaps surprise or something akin to gratitude. But she says nothing, giving the moment the space it demands to breathe. "You," the older man says, turning his focus directly to the man in the apron. The weight of his pointed address bears down on the room like a thundercloud. "What are you hoping to accomplish by stepping out here with your thinly veiled authority? You see a room tense with conflict and decide to add yourself to the fire? What are you protecting?" The man in the apron straightens, a defensive sneer curling his lips. "Protecting my restaurant," he snaps, his voice taut with irritation. "From a scene like this. From things blowing up and ruining this place for people who come here to eat." "There's no scene," Marcus interjects, his voice calm but unflinching. "Not until you decided to create one." A ripple of murmurs spreads through the tables, subtle agreements masked in soft noises. James tilts his head slightly, his eyes flickering between the black woman and the aproned man, noting each reaction. The man in the apron glares at Marcus, his jaw tightening, but his retort is cut off as the older man steps forward. "And what scene?" the older man counters, his tone rising just slightly. "Is it that ruins a place like this, A calm, collected woman refusing to shrink because someone else decided her presence was too inconvenient? Or the fact that you and others like you assume you have the right to dictate who belongs and who doesn't?" The rhetorical question settles heavily over the room. The air feels thick, as though the collective silence has turned into a tangible force, pulling attention to every word. The man in the apron falters, his bravado slipping further under the weight of the accusation. "Look, he starts, but the older man doesn't let him finish. "Do not patronize me with your explanations." His words are precise, and his volume is steady but unwavering. "You were hoping to intimidate, hoping to establish your place atop a hierarchy that has no business existing in the first place, and I am relieved to see that you have failed." Across the room, the black woman's lips press tightly together, her eyes steady on the older man. Marcus glances at her, waiting to see if she'll speak, but her silence feels more purposeful than passive. It's a kind of quiet power that holds the room in place. The man in the apron exhales sharply, his fists curling slightly at his sides. He opens his mouth to reply, but is interrupted by the unmistakable chime of the restaurant door swinging open. The sound jolts through the room like a crack of lightning, pulling every set of eyes toward the entrance. A woman walks in this time, her coat wrapped tightly around her as if shielding herself from the night's brisk air. Her expression is unreadable as she quickly scans the room, her short, confident strides carrying her straight into the center of the scene. Her presence commands attention, not because of her stature or appearance, but due to the unmistakable determination etched into the lines of her face. She stops just beyond the threshold, placing a small leather bag on a nearby table. "Is everything all right here?" she asks, her voice steady but loaded with unspoken implications. The way she squares her shoulders suggests this is not idle curiosity. Her gaze sweeps over the man in the apron and then to the black woman, studying each of them with equal measure. The older man steps aside slightly, as if making room for the weight of her presence, though his stance remains quietly authoritative. Marcus straightens in his chair, while James watches the newcomer with a discerning eye, his fingers tapping lightly on the tabletop. The black woman doesn't answer immediately. She looks to the man in the apron, whose posture has taken on a new stiffness, then to the leather bag placed so deliberately on the table. Something in her gaze sharpens, a quiet warning flashing behind her eyes. And finally she speaks, her voice clear and unwavering in the stillness. "We'll see." Marcus shifted in his chair, leaning slightly forward but endeavoring to maintain an air of calm. The black woman sat motionless, her fingers clutching the edge of the table as though to ground herself in the midst of the encircling tension. Across the room, diners exchanged uneasy glances, their repeated attempts to zone out of the unfolding scene proving futile. Near the wall, James sat upright, hands intertwined in front of him, his piercing gaze assessing every expression, every movement. The air between them all hung thick with uncertainty. The newcomer, the woman with the leather bag, stood with her shoulders squared, sending ripples of quiet authority through the room with her presence alone. She placed one hand lightly on the strap of her bag, her eyes sweeping past Marcus, the black woman, and finally the pacing man in the apron. Her lips pressed into a neutral line, and with 2 quiet steps, she moved closer to the black woman's table. "May I?" Her voice was steady, deliberate. She gestured toward an empty chair at the table. Though there was no hesitation in her tone, it felt less like a question and more like a formality. The black woman didn't reply immediately. Her gaze met the seated woman's briefly, unreadable, yet alert. After a calculated pause, the black woman offered a single nod. "Go on." The leather bag made a soft thud against the chair as the woman lowered it, sitting down with movements as deliberate as her tone. Her jacket, a muted green, contrasted against the dark wood of the chair, creating an unintended focal point in the already charged room. Marisol, as her badge indicated in faint lettering, adjusted her posture just enough to align herself squarely with the black woman, neither too imposing nor overly conciliatory. "You've had an evening," Marisol began. Not a question, but a statement. Her voice carried no pretense of pity or false concern, merely acknowledgement. It carried enough weight to draw Marcus's attention, though he didn't interrupt. James, across the room, remained silent but somehow felt even more present, as if anchoring himself for something unseen. The black woman tilted her head slightly, her expression still a fortress of self-control. "I have," she replied, the simplicity of her words laced with unspoken awareness that needed no embellishment. Marisol exhaled lightly, as though considering the weight of her next statement. "From where I'm standing, everything that should have been done to resolve this hasn't been. And that puts us both in an awkward position. I suspect mine's the easier one." Marcus shifted. "Is there a reason you're here?" His tone was sharp, not unkind, but clearly skeptical. He leaned back in his chair slightly, though his eyes stayed locked onto Marisol. Marisol turned toward Marcus briefly, her eyes narrowing slightly with appraisal. "Right to the point, fair. But let me ask you something instead." She gestured lightly toward the black woman. "When people see her standing up to everything she has this evening, what do you think they remember? Her actions? Or theirs?" The question hung in the space between them. It wasn't rhetorical. Marcus opened his mouth to reply but stopped short, realizing that Marisol wasn't seeking an answer. Instead, it was the black woman who responded, her voice measured but pointed. "Most people," she said slowly, "don't remember anything." This moment of quiet resilience landed heavily, drawing soft murmurs of discomfort from the tables nearest to hers. Marisol's lips pressed into a thoughtful line, not in agreement, but acknowledgement, a subtle but important distinction. At the far counter, the younger server who had first dropped his tray slowly gathered another stack of dishes, his hands still trembling faintly. He glanced toward James, who gave him an imperceptible, steadying nod, perhaps offering reassurance without words. They had all been pulled into this, like ships caught in a relentless tide, unsure of shorelines. The world doesn't stop spinning just because one moment goes wrong. Marisol finally spoke, her voice low but firm. But what people do in those moments, how they turn their discomfort into action or inaction, speaks volumes. Her eyes narrowed slightly as her focus landed back on the black woman. "So let me ask you, when this story gets told, what do you want them to remember?" The black woman held her gaze, something indescribable flashing in her eyes before settling into a quiet but burning resolve. And when she finally replied, it was with words so carefully chosen that they resonated through every corner of the room. "I want them to remember they didn't silence me, and that they couldn't." She let the words breathe, refusing to fill the silence that followed. Marisol's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a faint pull of respect at the corner of her lips, a glimmer in her eyes that suggested she had gotten what she came for. She stood slowly, reaching down to reclaim her bag, though her steps remained measured. "That," she said finally, her voice just loud enough to carry, "is worth remembering." The chime of the door felt louder than it had all evening as Marisol exited the restaurant, leaving behind an unmistakable hole where her presence had been. For a moment, nothing moved. Even the outside traffic lights casting faint traces of shadow felt distant. And then, James broke the silence, not with words, but by standing. He stepped closer to the table, his normally detached demeanor momentarily replaced with quiet warmth. "Hey," he said softly, addressing the black woman directly, "dinner's cold, and regardless of tonight, you still deserve to enjoy yours." His tone was simple, free of pretense. But before the black woman could reply, the hush of the restaurant was broken once more, not by words or clamor, but the sudden, unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching quickly from outside. The door chime didn't ring, and within seconds, a shadow passed the window, accompanied by the faint but deliberate knock reverberating against the glass. The moment hangs in suspension, the rhythmic knock against the glass reverberating through the restaurant. Heads turn instantly toward the door, every eye caught between unease and anticipation. By now, the room feels like it has taken on a life of its own, with its occupants merely cogs in an unpredictable machine. The black woman freezes mid-action, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. Marcus straightens his posture, his face a calculated mask of awareness and caution. James, standing a few feet away, shifts his weight as his sharp eyes zero in on the window. The dimly lit figure outside is no more than a shadow, a blurred outline obscured by reflection and the night's dark cloak. The air in the room tightens like a rope being pulled taut, and yet no one moves, not yet. It is as though everyone inside is frozen in time, collectively holding their breath, waiting for what or who might cross the threshold next. The knock comes again, louder this time, almost impatient. Marcus glances at the black woman. A silent exchange passes between them. A flicker of question, followed by mutual resolve. He rises from his seat. "I'll get it," he says softly, though his voice does not invite rebuttal. She makes no effort to stop him, her gaze instead burning toward the glass as if to see past the distorted shadow that has seized everyone's attention. As Marcus approaches the door, his steps deliberate, the restaurant grows even quieter. Even the faint clinks of utensils on porcelain are extinguished, the ambient hum of the space smothered under the weight of anticipation. The chime heralds his hand finally meeting the door handle, its cheerful jingle at odds with the tension within the room. Marcus exhales deeply, his chest rising and falling methodically. He swings the door open. The figure steps into view, the form sharpening under the fluorescent lights of the restaurant. A man, not much older than Marcus, but carrying a different kind of wear, etched into the lines of his face. His clothes are worn, not careless but functional, as though he has just come from a long day of physical labor. His expression is solemn but not unkind, though there is a guardedness in the set of his jaw. Behind him, the cool night spills in, lending a chill to his arrival. "I hope I'm not intruding," the man says, his voice deep and calm, almost disarmingly so. He looks past Marcus for the briefest moment, his gaze landing on the black woman seated at her table. Even from across the room, she feels the weight of that glance, its purpose still unclear. "You are," Marcus replies without hesitation, his voice firm but not aggressive. He plants himself in the doorway, his broad shoulders cutting a shadow against the warm light spilling outward. This isn't the time, or the place. The stranger nods slightly, acknowledging Marcus's stance but not retreating. "I'm here for her," the man says, motioning slightly toward the black woman before his eyes shift back to Marcus. "I mean no harm." "Who are you?" comes the response, quick and sharp. Marcus's posture stiffens, his frame exuding silent authority. The man outside doesn't immediately respond, his silence adding a fresh layer of tension to the brittle atmosphere. Behind them, conversations among the diners have stopped completely. Even the faintest whispers have ceased, as if the restaurant collectively leans in for the reply. "My name's Arthur," he says at last. The simplicity of the answer carries a gravity that lingers. He looks again toward the black woman, his focus unwavering. "I worked with her husband. I thought she'd want to know." The mention of her husband breaks something fragile in the air. The black woman's face tightens for a flash of a moment, her composure briefly faltering before she resumes her mask of control. Marcus doesn't move immediately. His hesitation betrays that every part of him wants to close the door, to end this strange second act of the evening's chaos before it begins. But something stops him. Perhaps it is the steadiness in Arthur's tone, or maybe the glimmer of recognition now visible in the black woman's eyes. "It's fine," she says suddenly, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension. All eyes dart toward her. No hesitation lingers in her tone, though the weight in her words is unmistakable. She stands, her posture poised but resolute. "Let him in." Marcus steps aside reluctantly. He doesn't speak, but his watchful presence remains heavy as Arthur steps past him into the light of the restaurant. Arthur moves with purpose but not haste, every step calculated without seeming contrived. He stops a few feet from her table, his hands loosely at his sides. He nods slightly, his eyes meeting hers directly now. "Ma'am," he begins, his voice low but steady, "I came here because I don't know how to say this, but there's something you need to know about what happened." A faint murmur ripples through the room, as though the fragile quiet has finally reached its breaking point. The black woman doesn't respond immediately. Her hands rest lightly on the back of her chair, her knuckles just barely tensing against the smooth wood. "What happened?" she says at last, her voice devoid of emotion but cutting nonetheless. Arthur shifts uncomfortably, his composure flickering just slightly. "Whatever you've been told," he says carefully, it wasn't the whole truth. Some things went down at the site, things that he cuts himself off, his words momentarily catching in his throat. He glances around the room, the sudden awareness that dozens of eyes and ears are absorbing every word dawning visibly on him. Marcus steps forward slightly, his presence once again grounding the moment. "If you have something important to say to her," he says slowly, his voice calm but strong, "then say it. Don't dance around it." Arthur exhales sharply, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of everything he is holding back. "I need to talk to you," he says, addressing the black woman directly now, privately. The pause that follows is suffocating. The diners shift in their seats, their apprehension palpable. The black woman takes a deep breath, her expression unreadable. "No secrets," she says finally, her words heavy with quiet defiance. "Say it here." Arthur hesitates, his eyes flickering toward Marcus and then back to her. The telltale war of reluctance and determination plays out in his features. He lowers his gaze briefly before raising it again. "It wasn't an accident," he says, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened? It wasn't an accident." The revelation strikes like a lightning bolt, electrifying the room. Gasps ripple through the crowd, and even Marcus's calm exterior falters for a blink of a moment. The black woman stands frozen, her composure shattered briefly by the power of those words. But she doesn't move, doesn't speak, as the shock hangs suspended in the charged atmosphere. Everything in the room feels like it has been pulled to the precipice of something far greater. "I had to tell you," Arthur says finally, his voice trembling slightly but steady enough to anchor the moment. "You have a right to know." The black woman stares at him, unblinking, as if trying to process the enormity of what has just been placed at her feet. Marcus moves closer, instinctively protective. But before anyone can respond, the faint sound of something shattering glass, perhaps, echoes from outside. Everyone turns sharply toward the doors, where a new shadow passes along the glass, ominous and unrecognizable, leaving the room charged with dread. There's revelation had stolen the breath from the room. The claim lingered like a ghost, pressing heavily upon every person present. The black woman was still standing, her frame taut, her fingers gripping the edge of the table for grounding, but her eyes bore nothing of composure. Shock radiated from her, but there was something else, an unformed anger, shimmering just beneath the surface. Marcus stood behind her now, close enough to act as her silent anchor, his jaw tight and his gaze burning holes into Arthur. Arthur, for his part, appeared weighed down by what he had just confessed. His shoulders hunched slightly as if expecting the room itself to lash out at him. His gaze flickered nervously to the black woman, seeking something that wasn't their understanding. Forgiveness, perhaps even blame. He steadied himself with a deep breath, his voice breaking the silence before anyone else could find theirs. "I didn't know how to come forward with this," Arthur murmured, though his voice carried across the room. "But you deserve to know. And I needed to tell you myself." The black woman finally moved, her body turning slowly to face him, though her hands remained on the back of the chair. "Why now?" she asked, her voice low, restrained, and yet dripping with incredulity. "If it wasn't an accident, why are you only coming to me now?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Arthur's face fell slightly, but he didn't shy away. "Because I didn't know what to do with it," he admitted, and because he hesitated, looking around at the sea of observing faces. "Because I was afraid of what would happen to me if I said something earlier." There it was, the crux of his guilt. His admission landed with a dull thud, drawing quiet, contemptuous murmurs from the diners who had no doubt been wondering the same thing about him. Still, no one dared to interrupt. "You were afraid?" the black woman repeated, her voice tinged with bitterness. She stepped away from the chair, closing the space between herself and Arthur. Her body seemed to vibrate with energy, danger even, but she remained composed, a storm held tightly in check for now. "You were afraid, so you stayed silent, and now you want to absolve yourself by bringing me half answers in a restaurant?" "I couldn't," Arthur began, but faltered, swallowing hard. "It's not absolution I want. I know what I did. Staying quiet for as long as I did was wrong. But please believe me, what happened, it wasn't something I could ignore, and it's not something you should have to wonder about anymore." The black woman stared at him, searching his face for truths buried between his words. The weight of his guilt was evident, but so was his desperation. Marcus finally interjected, his voice sharp and cutting. "You can't just drop something like this and expect her to, what? Process it on the spot? Fix your conscience for you?" Arthur turned to Marcus, his expression raw. "I don't expect her to fix anything," he argued quietly. "I just needed her to know that her husband, what happened to him, it wasn't just bad luck. It was negligence. It was misconduct. There were rules ignored, corners cut, and it cost him everything." A harsh intake of breath cut across the room. The black woman's hands balled into fists, her gaze dropping momentarily before snapping back to Arthur. "Do you have proof?" she demanded, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "Or is this just guilt talking? Because if you don't have proof—" "I do," Arthur interrupted quickly, his own voice growing steadier now. "I have emails, documentation, things I copied after it happened. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I needed to get it to someone who could do something, someone who deserved to know." "Where is it?" Marcus asked, cutting through the budding argument like a scalpel. He stepped forward now, his imposing frame almost crowding Arthur as if daring him to waver. Arthur reached into his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. The room seemed to collectively tense, every diner leaning just slightly forward as if they too needed to see what he carried. From inside the worn folds of his coat, Arthur retrieved a battered envelope. He held it out toward the black woman, his hand trembling slightly but his grip firm. "This is everything I have," Arthur said, voice soft but unwavering. "It's not a full answer, but it's something." The black woman hesitated. For the second time that evening, she found herself standing at a crossroads that had been thrust upon her without warning. Her eyes darted between the envelope and Arthur's face, searching not for assurances but for intent, for sincerity. Finally, she reached out, taking the envelope from him with careful precision. Her fingers brushed the worn paper, feeling its weight as though the truth itself could somehow press through surface fibers. Just as she opened her mouth to respond, to speak, or perhaps demand more evidence, the delicate suspense of the moment was shattered. The unmistakable sound of shattering glass echoed from outside, followed by muffled shouting. The restaurant collectively turned toward the door, their unease pivoting to renewed alarm as the figure from the earlier shadow reemerged, a hulking, angry silhouette moving with purpose toward the restaurant, his hand gripping something ominously concealed beneath his jacket. Panic rippled through the room. Marcus stepped in front of the black woman instinctively, his jaw tightening as adrenaline surged through him. Arthur paled visibly, stepping back toward the nearest wall without thought. The diners shifted uneasily, their whispered queries growing louder. And then, the door swung open violently, the shadow stepping fully into the stark, unforgiving light of the restaurant. A new threat, breathing life into the night's unrelenting cycle of chaos. For the black woman, for Marcus, and for everyone watching helplessly, the next shoe had dropped, and it carried weight they had barely begun to comprehend. The room stood on edge, quivering under an invisible tension that gripped every person's breath. The figure at the door loomed large, swallowing the light as it strode inward, the sound of his boots pounding against the wooden floor syncing with the rapid thuds of hearts in the restaurant. Conversations fell silent. Movement stilled. The diner had endured a series of improbable events, but this moment felt different, more unrelenting, more final. Marcus positioned himself between the black woman and the intruder, his broad frame standing firm as if braced against a storm. Without a word, he inhaled deeply, his shoulders rising as he steadied the fierce protectiveness vibrating off his skin. Arthur, pale and trembling near the wall, watched the advancing man with wide eyes, his instinct to retreat barely masked. James, seated near the periphery, leaned slightly forward, his sharp eyes cutting through the tension like a razor, ready to act if necessary. The diners clutched their silverware or clung to their companions, their fear now laced with helpless curiosity. The intruder stepped fully into the fluorescent light, revealing sharp, angular features and a perpetual scowl carved into his stubbled face. His eyes darted toward the black woman, finding her almost instantly in the room. He lingered on her, studying her, but did not attempt to approach, not yet. The object concealed beneath his thick jacket bulged slightly, though no one in the room dared make the first move. "I'm looking for Arthur," he said finally, the low rasp of his voice cutting through the thick air like broken glass dragged across stone. His statement, while not shouted, rang out loud enough that the room involuntarily granted weight to his presence. His eyes moved momentarily to Arthur, who stiffened like a man caught in the crosshairs of something far larger than he could handle. Arthur swallowed a lump in his throat as if his body was trying to force courage from his core. He met the man's gaze but failed to hold it for more than a fleeting second. I'm here," Arthur stuttered, his voice faltering as he dared to step closer. Not to the man, but to Marcus, inching instinctively toward protection rather than confrontation. The man's lips curled slightly, more a grimace than a smile, as he regarded Arthur. "We need to talk. Outside." The finality in his tone silenced any protest Arthur might have been contemplating. It wasn't a request, it was a demand barely restrained by a thread of civility. "You're not taking him anywhere," Marcus interjected sharply, stepping forward with a measured strength that made it clear he was ready to hold his ground. His voice was calm but unflinching, a challenge calculated and deliberate. "Whatever you need to say to him, you'll say it here, in the open." The standoff deepened. The man shifted his posture, his body slightly angling toward Marcus. His gaze hardened, and his hand hovered far too near the bulge in his jacket for anyone's comfort. "This isn't about you," he growled, his threat couched in the low timbre of his voice. "So step aside." "No!" The black woman's voice rang out suddenly, clear and commanding, cutting through the tension like a cracking whip. All eyes turned to her. She took a step forward, meeting the man's hard stare without flinching. "You walk in here, disrupt this place, make empty threats like you're owed something, but let me tell you you're owed nothing. If you have something to say, then say it. Otherwise, leave." The man blinked, momentarily taken aback by her unwavering defiance. His hand froze near his jacket, the weight of her words pinning him in place. Around the room, faint murmurs of awe and unease rippled through the diners. Even Arthur, who moments ago seemed ready to bolt, stayed rooted to the spot, his jaw tight as he processed her boldness. The man exhaled sharply through his nose, his attempt at intimidation cracking slightly under her unyielding resolve. "Fine," he spat, his tone bristling with frustration. "Arthur's been talking to the wrong people, meddling where he doesn't belong. And now, because of that, well, let's just say people are interested." His eyes darted briefly to the envelope clutched tightly in the black woman's hands, his implication as clear as the tension suffocating the room. Arthur's face paled further, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to form words that wouldn't come. Marcus's fists tightened at his sides, frustration mounting as he realized the man wasn't there solely for Arthur, it was about silencing the truth. "You think this ends tonight?" the black woman countered, her words precise and cutting. She held up the envelope slightly, her voice rising in quiet strength. "What's in here, it won't stay hidden, no matter who you threaten, no matter who you try to silence." James stood now, slowly but deliberately, his motion drawing the room's awareness even as he remained at the edge of the chaos. His expression tightened, his piercing gaze locking onto the intruder. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm yet heavy with the weight of unspoken authority. "You're out of time," James said plainly. "Whatever grip you think you have, it's gone. Walk away while you still can." The man glared at James, his lips quivering as though searching for a retort he couldn't find. The room pressed down, the collective gaze of every face stripping away his assumed dominance piece by piece, and still, Marcus, the black woman, and James stood unshaken, their presence an undeniable wall that refused to fracture. Finally, with a growl of frustration, the man took a deliberate step backward, his posture still tense yet slightly defeated. "You have no idea what you're getting into," he said coldly, his words hanging as both warning and retreat. He turned abruptly, his boots pounding once more against the floor as he pushed through the door, the chime echoing in low, jangling notes as it swung shut. The silence that followed was deafening. The diners exhaled collectively, a wave of relief rolling through the room. Though the immediate danger had passed, the story was far from over. Marcus glanced at the black woman, her grip still firm on the envelope, the fire in her eyes unextinguished. James remained standing, his face stoic yet watchful as the tension slowly ebbed away. And then, Arthur broke the fragile quiet, his voice hoarse but resolute. "It's not over. Not until it's exposed. Every last bit of it." The black woman nodded, a small determined smile pulling at the corners of her lips. "Then we start now."